I'm a bit off duty now, but I'm just back to say the next session is going to be chaired by Professor Peter Jones, and it will be looking at 3 of the really important key national policy drivers that the new generation of LTPs will need to address, with suitable experts on hand to help with that discussion. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome back, everybody. So in the first session, we were looking very broadly at the history of LTPs, the challenges, and how the department is preparing for the future. And as was noted, the last LTP guidance actually came out in 2009, and clearly a lot of things have changed since then, and there are a new set of policy drivers, and we're going to be exploring some of those in this session, and in particular 3 of them. The one that's been discussed a lot this morning around net zero and decarbonisation, a second around levelling up and inclusion, and a third about transport and its wider planning context. So to kick off, we've got 2 speakers to touch on the first topic about net zero and decarbonisation. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Tom Gold, Associate Consultant at WSP. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Peter. Good morning. So yes, as Peter said, I'm based at WSP on our Transport Net Zero team, and we've been working with the Department for Transport in the preparation of this quantifiable carbon reduction guidance. So today I'm going to be presenting a very brief summary of this guidance, which of course has significance to this key policy driver to decarbonise transport through local transport plans. So as context, this guidance is a follow-on from the commitment made in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan to drive decarbonisation and transport improvements at a local level by making quantifiable carbon reductions a fundamental part of local transport planning and funding. And the intention of this is to support local transport authorities in understanding the local emission gap that needs to be addressed in line with carbon budgets and net zero, and to shape policies and programmes in consideration of that case for change to deliver ambitious carbon reductions in line with commitments, while doing so in a way that reflects the needs of different areas. And achieving this effectively requires an evidence-based approach. Having this evidence will allow local authorities to take informed decisions to influence carbon outcomes. And it's accepted there are challenges and inaccuracies to carbon quantification methodologies at this stage, but it is necessary that we overcome these to ensure that we're setting local transport in the right direction when such strategic decisions are made as part of an LTP. And it's for this reason that the DFT are developing this technical guidance. So this will be a standalone document published later in the year alongside the new LTP guidance, providing a framework approach and practical guidance for evidence-led consideration of carbon in LTP development and assessment. So the approach that we're developing will encourage local authorities to take these key steps. So firstly, estimating current and future transport emissions. This is something that can be done through modelling-based methodologies and tools, and it's something that many subnational transport bodies have already prepared for their regions and can be disaggregated for use by local authorities in their local transport plans. And this will give an indication of how emissions will change in the absence of an LTP, including consideration of key trends such as EV uptake. Additionally, outputs of this analysis can also be used to provide an insight as to where emissions come from. For example, the proportions of emitted by different modes or journey types, helping authorities target interventions where they have the greatest effect. And as a second step, to establish how a carbon reduction in line with carbon budgets and net zero be achieved. So where authorities have not defined local trajectories or pathways to achieve carbon budgets and net zero, this guidance will provide advice on how this can be done, providing indicative context of the emission reductions needed to be in line with these commitments. And with the outputs of task 1, this can provide an understanding of the case for change, the gap between where local emissions are heading without intervention and where they need to be. And the guidance advocates using this to set out objectives when developing the LTP and using tools such as logic mapping where appropriate to set out, alongside quantitative evidence, how an ambitious carbon reduction can be achieved and to shape an LTP accordingly. And with the evidence, case for change and objectives that are established in these first 2 steps, the guidance will encourage authorities to meaningfully generate and appraise options with consideration of carbon. So it's acknowledged that LTP shouldn't be developed irrespective of their carbon impact, and the methodologies provided in this guidance will help shape programs to deliver meaningful carbon reductions. And as this 4th step, to estimate the carbon impact of the intervention program. So after steps 1 to 3 has helped an authority to to estimate the carbon, develop their programme, will be asked to estimate the carbon impact of that programme. And the output of this step will provide an understanding of the extent to which an LTP will decarbonise transport, including wider impacts such as infrastructure carbon, which I'll come on to in a moment. And to undertake these quantification tasks, the guidance will provide a hierarchy of methods to reflect different capabilities and stages of scheme development. But for proportionality and accepting that most schemes identified in LTP will be at a very early stage, the primary method relied on will be things like benchmarking, enabling quick estimates of the scale of likely impact in a manner that is quick and easy to do and requires only minimal scheme information. And the department and their partners are working to develop these data sets. And in the development of this guidance, we have been aware that an LTP is just one stage at which carbon will be considered and influenced. Whole life carbon appraisal within business cases and the use of carbon management plans is increasingly being adopted as best practice. And such scheme level processes will shape the interventions as they're taken forward from an LTP, seeking to influence design decisions such as material choices to maximise their carbon performance. But it's at this LTP stage that there is a greater opportunity to influence carbon outcomes, despite this being when there's the least definition of schemes and accuracy of assessments. So the role of such an assessment as part of an LTP is therefore strategic, for example, to support decisions on what to build rather than how. The guidance will also recognise that the influence of an LTP on decarbonisation extends beyond transport user emissions. It also does include infrastructure carbon. And this is encapsulated within this concept of whole life carbon and the constituent infrastructure impacts such as capital or embodied carbon and operational impacts such as energy use. And in line with changes that we're seeing taking place across transport planning to better manage these impacts, this guidance will support authorities in understanding the emissions associated with infrastructure. And it will do so in a proportionate manner, encouraging a focus on the greatest impacts and the use of benchmarking methods that minimise the effort needed to obtain these insights that will support decision making. And through an understanding of both user emissions and infrastructure carbon, authorities will be better able to shape LTPs that support decarbonisation of the economy as a whole, and to take actions to achieve this when there is this greatest opportunity to do so. So thanks very much for listening. The guidance is still under development, and further to feedback to gain today, we'll also be informed by responses to a public consultation that's planned in the coming months. But yeah, thanks very much for your time. And yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. That's really interesting, encouraging. I'm sure authorities will be really pleased that this work's going on because, most of them have set themselves ambitious goals, and I think they really need support and guidance from government. And the fact this will link with the new LTPs, I think, will be very valuable indeed. So thank you very much, and thank the department as well. So the second speaker under this topic is Helena Bennett, who's Senior Policy Advisor at the Green Alliance. So over to you, Helena. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Tom, for presenting some of the thoughts behind the quantified carbon reductions. Really encouraging to see. So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Helena Bennett. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance, and I lead on our transport work. In case you don't know, Green Alliance is a leading environmental think tank and NGO in the UK, and we work across lots of different policy areas, and transport is a really big focus for us. So I'm really happy to be here today. You've probably heard from other sessions this morning that transport is the largest emitting sector in the UK. It accounts for a third of our emissions if you include international aviation and shipping. And although there's been some good progress recently, we still face really big, significant challenges to decarbonising transport across most modes. Now, if you dive a little bit deeper into that emissions data, cars make up the biggest portion of transport emissions. And electric vehicle uptake has been really good recently. We're getting great trajectories. We've got a zero emission vehicles mandate expected to be introduced in a couple of years' time. And EVs are certainly going to get us a lot of the way towards cutting carbon from the roads. We published some analysis a few months ago that showed that even with really good uptake rates of electric vehicles, we still need to cut or reduce the number of total miles driven by cars between 20 and 27% by 2030 in order to stay aligned with wider UK climate targets. And the best way to achieve this, obviously, is to offer the public really good, affordable, safe, reliable, accessible green alternatives, whether that's public transport or whether it is walking and cycling. So we all know, we're all here because we know that local level transport services are what keep this country running, getting people to work, to see their friends and family, getting people to school. And local authorities are key to delivering good public transport services and good walking and cycling infrastructure. And we were really, really pleased that the Transport Decarbonisation Plan published last year had a highlight on quantifying emissions reductions in local transport plans. And the fact that there's a whole section on this panel today is really encouraging. And it just shows that DFT is serious about decarbonisation and that they understand how important local delivery is in achieving it. So Greg mentioned this earlier, but I think a really important part of this whole puzzle is understanding that actually acting on climate and setting good climate targets and implementing good climate policies helps with other big societal issues that we are all facing and that government is trying to create solutions for. So whether that's the cost of living crisis, whether it's social mobility and the levelling up agenda and reducing inequalities, whether it's reducing air pollution and therefore having a better impact on health and well-being, and also improving health and well-being through more people being outside, walking and cycling, and of course, reviving and connecting local communities. And then if you put all this against the backdrop of continuing rising fuel prices and a need to reduce our reliance on the import of foreign fossil fuels, especially with a phase out and ban on Russian oil and gas coming up, I think it's safe to say that action on climate has never been more important. And luckily for us, it can also help us achieve lots of other targets and goals as well. So there's great ambition in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan across the board, and it got buy-in from the public and politicians alike, which is very encouraging. Delivering on the ambitions set out in the TDP is obviously the next big challenge, and from a carbon reductions point of view, the governance behind how this happens will be really important. And there's just a couple of examples I want to pick out. So it was really good to hear just now from Tom that national carbon budgets and targets will be used where local plans don't yet have their own pathways developed. It's going to be vital that there's a good understanding of how those top level national targets trickle down to the subnational transport bodies and then down to local authorities. That's not entirely clear yet, I don't think. It was also encouraging earlier to hear Nicola say that there's quite a lot of focus on the planning side of things and join up with the Department for Housing, Levelling Up and Communities. We need to make sure that firstly, the local delivery plans support whatever's happening in the world of LTPs, because there is, of course, a risk that the two could be non-complementary. And more broadly, planning of new developments needs to make sure that we have good access to public transport and walking and cycling infrastructure, as well as those local delivery plans, making sure that they conform to what's laid out in the cycling, walking and infrastructure strategy and bus service improvement plans and all those other, and gear change and all those other kind of small, not small, they're not small, they're very big, plans that DFT have introduced. Another thing just to mention is about the baseline, which I think is probably part of what Tom's work is looking at, and which baseline for emissions reductions is going to be adopted, especially thinking about consideration for local authorities that have actually done some and made some really good progress on emissions recently. The funding and resourcing model needs to be really clear. There was a bit of a discussion about that earlier as well, especially around issues with competitive funding, which has thrown up problems for the BSIP programme. A competitive funding model was talked about in the Levelling Up white paper, and we're calling for a shift towards a better, stronger funding model, which are longer term and allow local authorities to plan more strategically. And of course, this whole process needs to be very closely monitored and evaluated by DFT at pretty regular intervals to check in on the resourcing and funding allocations and the delivery of plans, and whether or not authorities are sticking to the kind of the emissions reductions targets that they have set for themselves. So just a couple of final thoughts. It's imperative that this new guidance isn't just something that has been developed and then gets put on a shelf and isn't really touched again. So we're pleased that there is a lot of emphasis on the carbon emissions, especially here. It's really helpful for those of us working in the climate agenda. And it's going to play a really big role in decarbonising our transport system and in turn helping the UK reduce its emissions in line with wider climate targets. So overall, really encouraging. And we really hope that the delivery of it is robust and it works.
Thank you very much, Helena, for your insights there. And it's good to know that your organisation is closely working to encourage these changes among the transport sector. That's really great. Thank you. So that's the first of the major new challenges that have come along since 2009, really, or been recognised more fully around decarbonisation and net zero carbon. The second one, obviously, that's come up a lot in the last 2 or 3 years is levelling up and a growing concern about inclusive economic and social development. And I'm very pleased to welcome Kris, Director of Social Research Associates, to give us some of her insights in that area. Thank you, Kris.
Thanks, Peter. Hello, friends and colleagues. Glad to see so many people here talking about this really important issue. For the past year, I've been working on research and engagement in relation to transport-related social exclusion for Transport for the North, Transport for Greater Manchester, and many local authorities. And the results of this, which is concentrated on people who are transport-related socially excluded, is showing that there are some big issues which link to the levelling up agenda, which I feel are in danger of being neglected. So lots of issues coming up, but I thought in the time available, I would just pick out 3 issues, which I do feel we need to look at a bit more. And the final thing I will make in context of this is that people who are transport related and socially excluded are not necessarily the same as the traditional equality groups that we usually monitor. So I hope you'll see that as I go through. So the first issue I want to talk about is car ownership. And that diagram there, the hierarchy of provision, is taken from Surrey's County Council's local emerging draft local transport plan. And you'll see right down the bottom, just above there, is private car. Now, the research we've done has shown loads of examples of how the private car is absolutely essential for vulnerable groups, for poor people, particularly in relation to, say, employment. Many people were having to go to business parks in out-of-town areas, the sort of places that we've given planning permission to in the past without much thought of it. So we spoke to someone in a big call centre and said, how do your people get there? And they said, well, it's not up to me, it's up to them, isn't it? And so these people, others are making chain trips, childcare, checking on an elderly patient, then going to work, then picking the kids up from school. Public transport, absolutely not viable, and leading to criminalisation of people who are running these old bangers because they can't afford increasingly fuel. Repairs with increasing number of potholes mean that they need repairing. They haven't got the money for that. Some of them haven't even got money for driving lessons, and they've been done for various things and shouldn't be driving. So criminalisation is also a factor. And I think that we haven't properly thought about the implications of this. So looking at what I would hope to see in LTP guidance here is a really strong link with planning. And I think we said earlier in the conference that would be 30 years, after 2030. I think we have to do something before that. The whole issue of motoring charges has come up, and the ITC, Independent Transport Commission, have done a lot of work on the impact of different charging regimes. I don't think we're thinking much about the implication of that on TRSE. And finally, bus fare structures, where people who are poor can't afford to buy a weekly season, or the fare structure on buses doesn't really help them with their chain journeys or getting to out-of-town places. So I think there's a lot of policy issues I would like to see flagged up, so that it's not just what I would call motherhood and saying everyone's got to start walking and cycling. What about these people who rely on the private car and really can't afford electric cars, particularly when I see the insurance costs and the maintenance costs of electric cars? So moving on to my second issue I wanted to raise, and that's about shared use. And again, I noticed a lot of draft LTPs which are glossing over this and just assuming that that can happen. And right back to 1998, we did some Department of Transport research with Sustran about attitudes to shared use. And we ended up doing a special survey of disabled people, particularly deaf people, of the problems they had. And once again, in the research I've been doing recently, massive problems, to the point that we met people who actually had given up going out as pedestrians or as wheelchair users because of shared use, particularly deaf people who you rarely hear mentioned in terms of this, but also people with children and so on. We really need to revisit that shared use issue. And the photograph there is just a good example. I've got loads on camera, but you imagine this as a pedestrian. You cross that first place, okay, they've got raised pavements. Then you get to another crossing. You go along there for a few yards, then you have to go across another crossing to a hanging bus stop. Then you go to another crossing, and all the time you're at danger of cyclists bumping into you. And then you go to a fourth crossing, which takes you 200 yards out of your way compared to a direct route for cyclists. So the policy implications here, I think, are better design for walking, better design for pavements, and actually more engagement with pedestrians. We've done quite a lot of pedestrian audits where they actually walk around telling you things in the way they never would go online and tell you these things. So now the third issue I would like to raise. No, that's it. This is about digitally excluded. We are setting up some research for the ITS UK on this, but I'm sure people are aware of some of these figures, that there are differential. In fact, that figure's wrong. It should be AB 96 and DE 74 up there. So differential by social class. Lots of children don't have a phone. Many people over 75. And 2 million people no access to the internet. People run out of pay-as-you-go funds. And also we found in the research that lots of people who did have a smartphone had no idea of how to use it. And you see the picture there, that's me at Chopwell in part of the research. Here, there's one bus an hour. The school children were dependent on it. The bus didn't turn up. It started to rain. Nobody had a smartphone to find out what had happened. There was no bus shelter and nobody knew what to do. And the children were cold, hungry and wet. So the impacts on some of these people who are digitally excluded are losing jobs by not knowing that bus routes have changed, or disruption, isolation, people who just aren't connected, paying more, because if you take the example of getting, say, a senior rail card, a 3-year one can only be obtained online, and that's cheaper than going to the station and getting the 1-year one. There are security issues of not knowing about disruption and so on. So policy implications here are, and I'm not saying that we've got to go back to everything in hard copy, because the transport system doesn't work like that anymore. So training. And actually, you know, if you have simple phones and working with companies that produce simple smartphones, give people minimal training. That is really helpful. Cheaper tariffs. A lot of people we spoke to here run out of time to use their phone. Real-time bus stop information, which can be very helpful. And finally, no discrimination for cash payers, because quite a few people either can't get bank accounts or don't have them. So in conclusion, the conclusion, I think, is nothing for us without us. So many of the people we spoke to had not taken part in online consultation, which many people had relied on, perhaps during COVID, but even beyond post-COVID. Their plans show no face-to-face work, no imaginative work of setting up market stalls, no work talking to children. So here are some pedestrian audits going on. There's so many techniques, and working with Temple, we're about to launch an engagement toolkit for local transport planning. So that's my final message. Nothing for us without us, and let's make sure that some of these exclusion issues are included in the LTP guidance. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Kris. I think you made that point very strongly and very clearly. And clearly, when we talk about levelling up, although it has a strong regional dimension, or is perceived to have a strong regional dimension, the social dimension really underlies that, and it's crucial. And the points you were making about considering people on low income, we were talking in the previous discussion about whether we're going to have to use national road pricing and things like that. So understanding where low income people are, and often the same people as those that are digitally excluded. So these things clearly need to be taken fully into account. So thank you very much. We'll come back to that, I'm sure, in the discussion in a little while. But thirdly, I'd like to move on to the third policy driver we're going to be discussing, which is about linking transport and wider planning issues. And I'm very pleased to invite Nicola Kane, who's Head of Strategic Planning, Insight and Innovation at Transport for Greater Manchester, to give us her thoughts on that. Thank you, Nicola.
Thanks, Peter. This is a subject that's very close to my heart as someone who comes from a land use planning background, but has worked in transport all of my career. So it's really great to be talking on this topic. And actually, I seem to have spoken on this a few times in the last month or two, which I guess is showing that it's back on the agenda in terms of how we integrate transport, not just with land use planning, but with wider planning of services. And I think maybe Peter touched on this in the session at the beginning of the day. So in the 8 years or so that I've been at Transport for Greater Manchester, we've put a huge amount of time and energy into producing integrated plans and to working collaboratively across a number of strategic plans in the city region. I look after our strategic planning team. We've been heavily involved in developing our Greater Manchester strategy, which is the overarching mayor's strategy with the strapline Good Lives for All. And transport is woven right through that document. We've also been working very closely with colleagues at the Combined Authority and the 10 local authorities to develop the Places for Everyone plan, formerly known as Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. It's now a plan of the 9 out of 10 authorities. That's been a long time in the making and is heading towards an examination in public in the summer. Our current local transport plan, which is our 4th local transport plan, which is the Greater Manchester Transport Strategy for 2040. And that was first published in 2017. And we did a light touch refresh last year alongside the publication of a 5-year delivery plan that sets out more detail on our priorities for the next few years. So I think we've been doing a pretty good job as far as we can to align our strategic plans. And actually, if you look at the way we've structured our current local transport plan, our 2040 strategy, we moved away from structuring it around modes and much more around the different sorts of journeys that people might be making across Greater Manchester. And we brought in this idea of spatial themes, which I suppose stop us from thinking just about those kind of big flows in and out of the regional centre, but also neighbourhood trips, those very short trips, trips that you can see here in orange across the wider city region, which tend to be very car dominated, and trips in and out of the region. And I think that kind of framing of the strategy helped us to think a bit differently about the role of connectivity alongside land use planning and wider service planning. And we haven't just said that's a good thing. We've actually set ourselves targets for each of those different trip types in terms of mode share and also the volume of trips that we're targeting over the period to 2040. So you can see here that we've got separate targets for each. And with a shift, with a different focus in terms of whether it's more focused on active travel, particularly for neighbourhood trips and regional centre trips, or whether it's more about shifts to public transport, so particularly in that wider city region theme. And we set out a number of steps for how we were going to achieve that right mix, and that, again, that doesn't just focus on improving the sustainable transport alternatives. It thinks about how we can deliver services closer to where people live, so we can actually increase the number of those local trips and hopefully start to reduce the number of trips that people have to make longer distances to access key services. So it's very much a sort of integrated approach to achieving those targets. So just going to touch very briefly on the land use planning work we've been doing. And as I say, we work closely both at a Greater Manchester level, working on a joint development plan document, and also on the local plans that each of the local authorities are developing to support that Places for Everyone plan. And we're looking long term, so looking to set out the housing and employment growth that we need over the next 20 years to support national targets, and making sure that those go in the best possible location, so with a particular focus on accessibility and sustainable development within that. And colleagues in our strategic planning team have been working closely with those authorities and with the CA to develop a whole suite of evidence and analysis to support those plans. So we've gone through a number of steps, which starts by looking at development land, which is close to public transport facilities, community facilities in and around our town and city centre, for example, looking at increasing densities near public transport hubs, doing a range of studies and master plans that look at how we can further boost the accessibility and the sustainability of those new sites. And also looking at where we can establish new public transport connections, particularly by bus, actually, for a number of these sites. And then finally looking at things like electric vehicle provision, freight and logistics, and so on. And then how we can deal with any residual impacts. And all of that has fed into the current Places for Everyone plan, which, as I said, is going to examination public this summer, and that sets out the growth locations, which are very strongly focused in and around our key centres. And this just gives a bit of an indication of some of the integrated planning work we did early on in bringing planning colleagues together with transport colleagues to look at the different connectivity land use issues that we were facing. And again, we used that spatial theme structure so that we didn't just get dragged into focusing on the really big, more strategic flows, but also looking at some of those local issues. And that kind of framework, we held a whole series of workshops. That framework was really productive in thinking across the range of different transport and accessibility needs that we needed to set out in our plans. So all of that work is not only fed into the land use plans, but has also very heavily informed our 5-year transport delivery plan, which is part of our local transport plan, and we published that back in 2021. So if you want to take a look at that, that sets out a number of investment maps, and this formed the basis for our CRSDS funding prospectus, and we've now got around 1.2 billion to deliver key components of that plan over the next 5 years. So that's great that we've been able to use that plan to really shape our investment proposals and now moving into delivery. So just before I finish, I wanted to touch on, I think perhaps Peter Jones touched on this earlier in his presentation, on some work, some brilliant work we've been doing with the NHS over the last couple of years, which is a Civitas European funded project called SUMP Plus. They always have nice snappy titles. And this has been focused on how we can establish and develop much more effective cross-sector working between the health sector and transport, with a particular focus on decarbonisation. And we've been working with local colleagues in the NHS at a Greater Manchester level to look at how we can start to join up key policy themes within our different plans. We've been working closely with NHS colleagues on their new green plan and help them to write a transport chapter within that, which I think raised quite a few issues which perhaps weren't on their radar previously. And we've also been working with them on a number of shorter term actions. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of very quick examples of some good collaborative planning work and activity that service providers can perhaps replicate in terms of delivering more sustainable transport outcomes. So the first one was collaborative working we did to help the NHS to identify suitable locations for new community diagnostic centres. And these centres in themselves, I think, are really helpful in terms of providing a number of key diagnostic services, blood tests, x-rays and so on in local areas, so people don't have to travel longer distances to more specialist hospitals. And this case study here, using accessibility planning tools, so again, accessibility planning coming back into the fore to help them to identify the most accessible site within Oldham for this centre, with particular reference to deprived areas, and ensuring that those areas could reach that site by public transport, walking and cycling. And the second one, which I think Peter may have also touched on, was the Wigan Ethical Care Review, which was a really interesting piece of work. Number of social care providers providing at-home care to communities right across Wigan. There are a number of different providers working all across the whole borough. It meant a lot of driving. It meant that a lot of potential care workers were excluded if they didn't have a driving licence or a car. And by a relatively simple reorganisation, so that each provider just worked in a concentrated geographical area, they could not only deliver that service much more efficiently, but the care workers were also able to do that on foot or by bike in many cases. So sort of good outcomes all round in terms of well-being of those workers. I assume better care provision, and also reducing the amount of travel and carbon produced by that travel. So just to sum up, I've just given a few examples there. We firmly believe that cross-sector planning is absolutely critical. We don't think we can deliver all the outcomes just by focusing on transport. It is really rewarding to do that work, but it is very resource and time intensive, and capacity is often an issue right across different public sector services, and you do have to put the time in and put the effort in to get those rewards. And sometimes we found that sort of national contexts we're working in, where different sectors are working under different regimes, different policy contexts, different timeframes, doesn't always make that integrated planning that straightforward. And I remember when we published our 2040 strategy, planning colleagues were saying we probably need to wait until we're ready to go with the spatial framework, but actually that process has taken a lot longer. So we would probably still be waiting now if we hadn't gone ahead. So those processes work to very different timeframes and don't always make it easy to integrate. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. It's very impressive what you've been able to achieve in Greater Manchester. And I think because of the powers of the mayor and the devolution, that perhaps it makes it easier for you to tackle some of these issues that might be the case elsewhere. And in fact, I think we're going to the panel discussion now, but I'll just ask you one specifically first of all, asking about the approach that you've adopted. Integrating transport and land use planning is very impressive, but how do you think that might be applied in where you've got two-tier shire counties? I guess you've got an element of that, haven't you? Because the districts do still have some.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously working across with 10 local authorities. So actually, although a lot of that work is sort of channeled through the combined authority, we have had to work directly with all 10, sometimes with all of them in the room together, sometimes on a one-to-one basis, and across both their transport and their planning departments. So I can't see why this wouldn't apply. It's not always straightforward, and we do have a good history in Greater Manchester of working collaboratively across the 10, so we have that to our advantage. But I, you know, it's not. It is time consuming, but it's well worth the effort, I would say.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Right. Okay. Good. I'm glad our other speakers are coming back on now. Just let me start with 2 or 3 things I've picked up on from the chat and so on, and then Peter Stonham's also keeping an eye out in case I miss anything important. One that's come up in 2 or 3 questions in a way is to do with the sources of carbon. I mean, I'm talking about carbon emissions now rather than embedded in capital carbon. That a lot of the analysis local authorities tend to do in academics is based on trip rates and modal shares and so on. But obviously for carbon, it's more about lengths than rates. And I think Nicola touched on this by looking at trips of different lengths and different characteristics. But although we can do a lot, I think, in terms of shorter trips transferring from car to active travel, and that has all sorts of benefits, health-wise, safety-wise, whatever. In terms of actually making a big hole or dent in the carbon targets, probably not as big as it would be in trip terms, because the trips are quite short. And I wonder, maybe Helena, what your view is initially, then I'll ask Nicola, about this question of really doing everything, but being aware we need to target the trips that really generate most carbon and in some ways are perhaps more tricky. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the obvious answer is we need to do all of it. So we can't just focus on one or the other. And while it maybe intuitively feels like local transport plans are focusing more on the short distance trips, especially when you get to urban regions, actually, and this is where the planning stuff comes in again, really importantly, there are still things that can be done to help encourage public transport use for long distance trips, whether that's better access to larger stations that have kind of big connections across the country that are servicing where you would do a long distance car journey, and making sure that bus routes are accessible to everybody and able to get to big stations that people can then use for long distance trips. There's also, we talked a little bit earlier about charging infrastructure, and for those long distance journeys where, bus or coach might not be appropriate, or people want to go in their car, making sure that the right kind of charging infrastructure is available in different places that are being traveled between long distance is still something that can be included in local transport plans. And I think a lot of this is to do with a wider kind of concept of just changing the norm away from car usage, regardless of whether it's long distance or short distance. If lots is being done at a local level and people are getting used to using buses more and walking and cycling more and getting on a train more frequently, they're more likely to start thinking about doing that for longer trips that they need to make, or at least, taking a bus part way and then driving part way, or getting into the habit of shared ownership of cars. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be thought about as one or the other. I think the whole thing around behavior change and modal shift, if done properly at a really local level for the smaller journeys, will naturally filter through into people's psyche for longer journeys. But importantly, I think there's lots to be done, especially around planning and thinking about making things like train stations accessible to people is really important, and not to be forgotten in local transport plan guidance.
Thank you. Nicola, how are you been recognising and then tackling this issue in your planning?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fundamental part of the pathway to our right mix targets, in terms of, over time at least, reshaping where people can access services, bringing more of those services closer to where they live, putting more housing in accessible areas. So that's a kind of, I suppose, a longer term view that that's part of the solution in reducing the length of car trips, because we do have a huge number, and particularly when you put those graphs on the basis of vehicle kilometres, most of our vehicle kilometres are in that wider city region category. So there isn't necessarily an easy alternative for those trips. So we do need to reshape activity over time. I think the other sort of key components of that, in terms of the approach we're taking, is to develop that much more integrated overall sustainable network. So we call it the B network. It's about bringing together buses, trams, ultimately trains, our bike hire scheme, and in time other shared mobility modes, so that people can much more easily and affordably move between different forms of transport. And that's got to be part of the solution, and that there aren't these huge financial penalties from moving from one part of the network to another. And I definitely see a role for things like car clubs as well in filling some of the gaps, that people don't have to own a car, but they do have access to a car when they need one, and we'll have to scale up car clubs significantly to deliver that. And we're putting a lot of investment into orbital public transport buses in particular between our towns, so that's a more viable alternative. And then I suppose the last thing probably just to mention is we've got a very extensive motorway network in Greater Manchester, and that almost acts as part of our local network, and people use that a lot for their day-to-day journeys. So we need to make sure that national highways are at the table as we're developing our plans. make sure that we've got a kind of consistent approach to how we manage the local and strategic networks, given that they shape so significantly people's day-to-day travel.
Thank you. I mean, on that last point, I think your experience is the same as many other, at least bigger metropolitan areas, where within the main conurbation, car use is levelling off or going down, whereas on the national motorway network, the traffic levels are still, leaving COVID aside, have still been going up, and obviously that can't go on forever.
Yeah, that's right.
Those trips begin and end in urban areas. Yeah. Okay. Kris, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I was involved, and I think many people in the audience listening, with a total transport project some few years ago, whereby we tried to integrate social services, education, health, and by and large it was not very successful. And it's great to hear that, you know, there are opportunities now where that particularly the health service are beginning to think about this. But I just wanted to say that we can think of some tricks here as well, which we can learn about how to affect behavioural change when we're trying to integrate planning. So one thing that came out of the Surrey work was that by setting up school travel streets and making it more difficult for people to park near the school, it resulted in quite a lot of people selling their second car, because the second car was largely used for that school trip. And if you couldn't do it, it didn't seem to make much sense. And then those people actually got bikes and started walking as well. And similarly, another thing that happened was saying to people in the discussion about electric cars, it's not just a case of, oh, well, I'll change my diesel car for an electric car, everything will be all right. The whole life carbon cost of manufacturing electric cars, of maintaining it, insuring it, and also the particulate impact even of electric cars really made people think twice about, oh, well, it will be all right if I get an electric car. So I think, you know, how we present information when we're trying to encourage integrated planning is really important. There's some tricks and quick wins here that we can use. Thank
you. Actually, picking up on that last point, Kris, this is something that came up in the questions and chat as well. That, and I've heard this in elsewhere in Europe, people starting to raise concerns in local authorities that people, that the public is starting to get the view, well, if I buy an electric car, job done, so I can carry on driving as much as I ever did. Yeah. And as we heard from Helena and elsewhere, that, and I think the same probably in Greater Manchester, to actually hit the targets we need to hit. We also need to be trying to reduce the total volume of traffic, but it's perhaps becomes a difficult sell when people think I've done my bit for the environment, I've got an electrical vehicle, I'm fine. Well, especially in places like Surrey, which has the highest rate of car ownership of any local authority, and that was the fix so many people told us they were going to make. Is that a problem you face in Greater Manchester, and have you sort of found a way of dealing with it, Nicola? Once I've got my electric car, I don't have to worry anymore, sort of thing.
I think we're still in the sort of early stages of that, but we certainly see that as a risk. They're expensive to buy, but they're pretty cheap to run. So we've been very conscious in that, and some of our policy making. We have published a first version of an electric vehicle charging infrastructure strategy, which again is sort of thinking about how we can sort of cluster charging infrastructure around kind of broader mobility hubs, and to sort of bring those sort of two policies a bit closer together. So it's not just about electric vehicles; it's about hopefully giving people access to shared alternatives, so they can access an electric car club vehicle alongside a whole range of other mobility services, and again don't then feel the need to buy an EV. And I think that would be particularly relevant for people who don't have off-street parking, which is a huge proportion of our population. We've got huge amounts of terraced housing as well as apartments. So I think that will probably be the biggest blocker to lots of people going out and buying electric cars in the longer run.
Helena, what's your thought about this? People saying, "Oh well, I've done my bit now. I don't have to worry."
Yeah, I mean, I think it just really highlights the importance of having both a good strategy for electric vehicle uptake and a good strategy for making sure that public transport services are working and affordable and accessible to as many people as possible. I think the truth is we're never going to live in a car-free society. So we have to be realistic about the fact that we're going to continue having a lot of cars on the road. And we can do as much as possible, especially through LTPs and the guidance, to encourage behaviour change and modal shift and make sure that the alternative is as attractive as possible. That's really ultimately the goal here, is to not to tell people you can't drive, but to offer such a good alternative that, you know, why would you want to get in a car when you can make the journey much faster and not be stuck in traffic and it costs you a fraction of the price? I think there is a bit of a risk that what we don't want to do as a kind of green movement is vilify the electric vehicle and switch people off from using it because it's now seen by some as a kind of, well, now we're being told we shouldn't get electric vehicles, we should get on a train instead. That we still have to make sure that we're moving on that transition to electric vehicles, because we can't keep, you know, we've now got a target date for phasing out petrol and diesel vehicles. We've got lots of EV charging infrastructure rolling out. I think the point around kind of car clubs and lift sharing is really important, especially for kind of, you know, groups and places that Kris highlighted. Sorry, perhaps, you know, the school run and sharing lifts, and there's lots that can be done by government and DfT to encourage that kind of behaviour change, where you're not telling people, you know, you shouldn't drive. It's just how we operate differently within the system. Final comment is just both of these things are really important and they do go hand in hand. It's not one or the other. We do need to make sure that we're doing both properly.
Yeah.
Peter, can I just say something quickly about rural areas here and integration? Some of the villages in deep rural areas that we spoke to had a lot of elderly people who really shouldn't be driving. They were, you know, perhaps in early stages of dementia, poor eyesight. We have a very poor regime in this country of checking up on people like that. But in one village I went to, they had actually designed an off-road footpath which would have been suitable for electric scooters as well, but they hit the fact that the land was not owned by the local authority, as it is in so many rural areas. In fact, some are virtually medieval in terms of land use. So again, you know, I think there's a challenge here when it comes to integrated planning to think about who owns the land and what planning powers people have in rural areas to actually tackle some of these mobility issues.
Thank you. I mean, going back to Helena's point, I think the messaging becomes really important, doesn't it? I mean, because, you know, people remember the sort of Dieselgate thing. Oh, we were all told to get electric diesel vehicles because that was good for the environment, and now we're being told that was the wrong thing to do. And there was a big backlash about that. So as you say, we've got to be very careful about saying you need to get an electric vehicle and then say, oh no, you shouldn't be using it. Then now you've got it. So I think that does need some nuancing and consistent thought at local level and also at national level. As you said, really on that. And I think that's really important. Just going back to your presentation, Nicola, Ben Plowden used to be a director at TfL, was agreeing with you about the whole point about cross-sector working and joining up, but any suggestions about how you can actually get institutions working up better and joined up government, you know, that will actually help deliver what we need to deliver, because it's obviously, it's not the thing you immediately think of, but often it's the thing that makes it very difficult to make these other things happen. Yeah,
I mean, I suppose starting with the national level, if things aren't joined up nationally, then it makes it harder then to develop a joined up approach locally. I think there are some really important shared outcomes that are starting to, I suppose, drive cross-sector, policy area collaboration. So decarbonisation is obviously one, levelling up is another, where it's obvious that different policy areas need to come together effectively, both nationally and locally, if we're going to deliver those outcomes. So I think that's a move in the right direction. But you know, when I think some of the policy framing when I first started as a transport planner, things like PPG13, we had for a brief period, we had a Department of Environment, Transport and the Regions that could actually bring those things together more effectively. I think that would definitely help. I think then cascading those shared outcomes down to a more local level is really important. So our Greater Manchester strategy is helpful for that, in that we've got a lot of shared outcomes that we're having to work across institutions to deliver. And we're relatively lucky in Greater Manchester that we have quite a long history of collaborating both across the 10 authorities, but also across different policy areas. But it is still really hard work, and you have to constantly work at it. We've got a lot of governance to help support that, but it requires a lot of individual effort, a lot of individual relationship building and relationship management to keep it going. And often it is down to that as much as it is around the formal processes. And then I suppose funding is the obvious sort of last point. It's great that we've got the CRSTS funding. That's brilliant that we've got some surety of funding over the next 5 years in Greater Manchester for transport, but it's clear that is to deliver transport outcomes. It makes it hard then to join that up with other bits of funding that are coming in from all sorts of different pots and work out how we can best combine those resources effectively. So I think being able to join up funding sources, having much more kind of multi-sector, multi-year, as much devolution as possible around funding, and not just capital but revenue funding as well. All of that is sort of key. We're definitely moving in the right direction, but there's a lot more that could be done on that, I think, that would help.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. A lot of what you were saying really goes back up to the national level, doesn't it? That I think increasingly authorities are learning to work with other sectors locally in various ways, but then when it filters up nationally, it tends to be separated. And I remember some years ago, I was doing some work in South Yorkshire around accessibility and so on, and we organised an event where we brought together health, education, retail, social services, etc., to look at some problems that local villages face. And we came up with some very creative solutions. And I remember at the end of it, the director of South Yorkshire Education said to me, he said, look, if we did half of those things, it would transform these people's lives. But once I leave this building, he said, I've got 2 targets to achieve nationally, which will determine my future job and the money for my region. And it's got nothing to do with any of this. And until you change the targets nationally, none of this is going to happen. And I think feeding that back up nationally, but I think once it's clear, perhaps locally, that these things need to happen and they can work, maybe it then becomes easier. Although I think there may be a structural issue. I remember years ago, discussion about accessibility planning, when that was all the rage. My perception was that the national government was very good in the Cabinet Office and so on, bringing together all the different perspectives to actually give a very multidimensional view about this. And Kris, I think, might have been involved. But when it came to implementation and making sure it's being implemented, they don't have a cross-government implementation body. So it had to go to a particular department. And there was some discussion about whether it should go to the Department of Work and Pensions or whether it should go to DFT. And they decided to give DFT the responsibility for accessibility planning. And as soon as they did that, everybody else said, oh, well, it's all up just about a few more bus services then, isn't it? And the whole thing fell apart. So maybe there are some quite serious issues at the national level that need to be tackled in parallel with the efforts that even other authorities are making to work better at the local level. Kris, did you have any comments on that?
Well, I was just going to say that when the guidance is finally published, one thing I hope will be included in it is the importance of good customer care in the transport industry and involvement of staff. So many people we spoke to didn't have the confidence to use the transport system, or they just used one mode, had never been on, for instance, the Manchester tram, but just used the buses, had no idea of routes. So again, I hope that there will be more liaison with staff. And after all, we know there's a massive crisis in recruitment for drivers and people at that grassroots level in the industry, but also realizing the importance of some of these really basic things of, making journeys with people that haven't done them before, people I mentioned who don't have smartphones and so on. So many of those things can be started now, even though they're part of that backcasting image that we spoke about earlier. So there's a lot to be done, and we don't have to wait to do a lot of it.
Thank you. One comment's just come in, or a question from Zach Vini, asking about effectively the role of micromobility, e-scooters, or new techno and cargo bikes and so on, and other things maybe on the horizon. I mean, I guess looking further forward, potentially autonomous vehicles. Nicola, do you feel that would it make a huge difference, or in the sense, is it more refinement to what you're doing, or would any of those seen as a game changer in some contexts, or drones, whatever?
Yeah, I mean, we've been quite good at running and securing funding to run various trials in Greater Manchester that have enabled us to sort of test the water with some of these technologies without, in advance of them, being rolled out more widely. We've got a project called eHubs running at the moment, for example, in parts of Manchester and Beuret, and we've provided electric cargo bikes and access to electric car clubs in some of those communities. And the e-cargo bike operator Cargaroo have been astonished with the uptake and how popular they've been, both with businesses and with families, for example, because you can put kids in the front of them, so sort of for leisure travel and so on. So that's giving us really good insight into what the markets might be for modes like that. And we've got a big e-scooter trial running in Salford at the moment around the university and out to Media City, which Salford University are evaluating for us again, so we can really understand the risks and the opportunities for that. And it is showing some replacement of short car and taxi trips, as well as obviously replacing some active travel trips, which we need to understand. So I think those trials definitely have a place and help us to understand where they might fit in the right mix, and I think gives us a bit of an opportunity to be reasonably reflective before potentially e-scooters are legalised at some point in the relatively near future. So definitely testing the water. I suppose cautious, reflecting on some of Kris's comments about potential conflicts between different road users. Very conscious of that. We want to make sure that any of these new modes are really adding value and delivering our wider outcomes, as well as delivering a good service for individual users.
Okay. Helena, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I mean, totally agree that we definitely need to understand a little bit more what kind of trips they're displacing, e-scooters and e-bikes specifically. If it's people that are already walking and cycling, it's not going to have an impact on emissions. If there's an opportunity for them to displace car miles, then great. There is a role, I think, and we've talked a little bit about throughout the day, the kind of rural versus urban. I think there is a role potentially for e-bikes to displace car journeys rurally that hasn't really been explored in any data or analysis that I've seen. So that's something for maybe, to be considered for LTPs that are in rural areas and have quite a lot of car trips that could be switched to e-bikes, for example, especially for people that can't use regular bikes and would like to cycle more, but don't because they need a motorized vehicle to help them. And then the other thing that we haven't really touched on at all is freight and deliveries and local tradespeople who use vans, where e-cargo bikes could be a good alternative to van usage. We're actually kind of scoping a piece of work that might look at this in a little bit more detail, and it is again more relevant for urban areas, but actually there's no reason why it couldn't also be applicable in rural spaces too. Vans are one of the only modes of transport that since 1990 has massively increased in the amount of emissions, and that's just primarily because of how different we live and our ability to order things online. And that data is actually from pre-pandemic levels. So I haven't seen any more recent data that has looked since mid-2020. So vans on roads, you probably see it when you look out your window, and especially if you live in a town or a city, are contributing a lot to air pollution and to congestion. And if there are ways we can switch to e-cargo bikes instead, there is potential quite significant emissions reduction savings. Like I said, don't have any analysis on that yet, but watch this space at Green Alliance, because hopefully we will be doing some more thinking on this.
Look forward to reading that. Thank you. Just going back, reflecting on Kris's presentation about, particularly, let's take the low income side of that. I mean, Kris, have you given thought about how you'd like that to be reflected in the new LTP guidance, and how you think local authorities could then make sure those considerations are taken through in their engagement, but also in their development of policy measures and so on?
I think that the trick is to combine engagement with behavioural change and strategic thinking. So not just asking people, what do you think, and leave it at that, but actually use the techniques we now have and the new census data which will be emerging for people to talk about priorities and trade-offs. So we end up with people understanding why we've made the hard decisions we're going to have to make, so that people end up thinking, well, you know, I don't agree with what they did. It didn't suit my family, but I understand why they've done it and I go along with it. And that's what members need, really, to have confidence to support us with our local transport plans. But I think to do that, we need much smarter methods of evaluation. We mentioned earlier the old accessibility tool. I think that we need new ways of digitally identifying priorities and trade-offs, so we can feed that into deliberative engagement. We can use all sorts of things like citizens panels, which the air quality people have already started using, lots of different techniques, making it clear why we're doing it. And after all, some of the things we need to know can only come from public and stakeholder engagement. We don't know all the answers as technical transport experts, so we need to feed that in so we've got an evidence base for when we come to evaluate it too. Did we meet the priorities and trade-offs, or did we not?
Okay, Nicola, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just building on some of Kris's points about engagement. We did a really interesting piece of work with Salford University to look at some of the emergency and proposed active neighbourhood schemes in Greater Manchester, sort of our version of low traffic neighbourhoods. And we had a researcher who basically embedded herself in those communities for a period of time and spent time walking around the streets, talking to different community members and local councillors as well about the proposals or the schemes if they'd already been put in. And that's given us, you know, such a rich source of information about how people perceived some of those interventions. They often perceived them to be, you know, all about cycling, for example, when they really weren't. But that's how people had felt. A lot of people felt they weren't for them because they were just for cyclists. If they weren't a cyclist, it wasn't relevant. And we got a lot of useful feedback about some of the things that were perhaps missing from the schemes. So they focused a lot on kind of modal filters, but hadn't really fully considered things like pavement parking. And if, you know, someone pushing a pushchair or in a wheelchair couldn't navigate safely along the pavements because there were cars parked all over them, it made very little difference whether there was a modal filter there or not. So it's helped us to get a really sort of much deeper understanding of both people's perceptions of those kind of interventions and also what we can do to improve them, and maybe some of the other measures that we can do without, you know, in advance of putting in, you know, more significant interventions. So I'd really recommend that kind of deep sort of qualitative research alongside some of the more strategic research that we often do, the more quantitative stuff.
Mm-hmm. In Kris's comments just now, she referred to trade-offs and things, and there's a question that's coming from Richard Brown about are LTPs important in providing a framework for deciding on road space allocation? Or could they be helpful in that? And I know you've done a lot of work, Streets for All and so on. I mean, is that something that you try and consciously link, or you think should be linked between the sort of LTP strategic level and what it means for road space reallocation on the ground? Yeah,
so obviously having those right mixed targets and having those broken down for different sorts of journeys gives us a really clear framework for then driving policies at a more local level. But we did decide to develop and publish a Streets for All strategy, which is a sub-strategy to the main LTP, to set out our thinking in much more detail around streets and establishing that street hierarchy, using the kind of movement and place framework, and looking at the different roles of different streets. And we're now developing those into a series of schemes through CRSGS funding, where we're going to have to make some tough decisions, particularly on those orbital corridors where we want to really significantly improve bus priority and active travel modes. They're pretty constrained corridors, so we're going to have to work really hard and engage very closely with communities and members to develop schemes that both achieve the kind of targets we're trying to achieve at a more strategic level, but also work and can be acceptable locally, and that people understand the rationale behind them, are actually involved in shaping them, and thinking about how we use parallel corridors and so on in some cases if we can't fit it all on that one corridor. So I think you do need that strategic framework, but then you do then have to set out, in detail about, well, how is this actually going to work in practice, and how do we involve people in shaping specific schemes, and helping them to understand kind of what the wider outcomes are that we're trying to achieve overall, which may not be immediately apparent.
Okay, thank you. I think Peter Stonham has been keeping a closer eye on the questions and things than I've been able to. Is there a final question that you've picked out from that I've not picked up on, Peter, you'd like to put to the panel?
Well, you've picked up some, and I've picked up the same ones in other ways, and there've been lots of discussion about the what I would call individual versus collective approach to transport. Very much what you've covered, Kris, but it's come up in discussion about EVs and the national policy, and then the individuals thinking, job done, I bought one. I just wondered, can you perhaps all explore how much personalised transport information and advice should be an outcome of an LTP? I mean, there was an era of personalised transport planning and behaviour change, which led to initiatives in some areas. Is it part of an LTP's job to turn that overall policy into individually deliverable information, do you think?
Can I just say, in answer to you, Peter, I think personalised travel information depends on motivation. And I just feel that one point we need to make in LTPs, and Peter and I are commissioners for the Independent Transport Commission, we've just published a book, Why Travel? And the message there is there's something fundamentally good about travel for human beings. And we don't want to be in danger of making people feel guilty about travel. So some of the work I've done with people that travel a lot shows that in providing personalised information, they lie, a bit like shy Tory voters. And we don't want to get in that situation. John Holland Kay of Heathrow says, after COVID, travel demand will be epic. And there is something about humanity that we need to travel. And so I think it's a delicate balance there. And if we stop making people feel guilty, they're more willing to give us their personalised travel information.
Okay. Helena, any last thoughts on that?
I said this earlier, but I think I'm not a behavioural change expert by any means, so I won't try and pretend to be. But I think it could be useful, and I do think with not just transport plans but wider everything government does really, and I'm thinking about climate specifically, obviously because of my background, but and my interests. But I do often think there's a bit of a missed opportunity about telling a story about why you're doing something, which has been alluded to already by others on the panel, and what is the impact going to be if something changes. And we've seen it with low traffic neighbourhoods a lot quite recently around, what good practice looks like and engaging the community and the consultation phase and good ways of doing it and not so good ways of doing it that end up in really different results. So I do think there's something to be said for communicating, not necessarily nudge behavior, but the why of something is changing. But actually, I think if it's possible to provide really good services that are accessible and affordable and reliable and clean, people will probably choose them. They will choose them. And so nudge behavior might be useful, but I don't think it's what's going to get people to change behaviors. I think actually providing the right infrastructure and services and opportunities is what will really change people's habits.
Thank you. Nicola, you're closest to the LTP process. I'll give you the last word on that.
Perhaps just go back to another. I know I keep talking about trials, but we did a really interesting project a few years ago, pre-COVID, which was a mobility as a service project, but we didn't have any digital services as part of it, digital platforms as part of it. We basically recruited various people from all walks of life to take part in a 2-week trial. And we had some real life people sitting in one of our interchanges and basically giving them a package of measures, a package of money basically to spend on different travel services. These were all people who were quite reliant on their cars, and for each day they would work up a personalised travel plan for them, give them vouchers to use, whether it was taxis, demand responsive transport, Metrolink bus, whatever it might be, showed them the cost of it, the carbon impact of it, and then it was up to them really whether they chose that or whether they continued to use their car. And when people were presented with the right information tailored to their specific needs, they very often didn't actually use their car. They used the alternative. So I suppose it sort of gave us some confidence that if we can then scale that up, and you give people the right information, that they will respond accordingly. And that was without making any improvements to the transport system. That was literally using the offer that was already out there, but packaging it in the right way. So I think that shows some potential for looking at giving people the right travel information alongside the right sustainable transport offer.
Thank you. So we're just up to 1 o'clock now. So I'd like to do two things. First of all, thank our panel, Nicola, Kris, and Helena, very much for contributing their presentations and also their insights in the discussion. And then I'm going to hand over to Peter Stonham just to wrap up the morning. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, thank you, Peter, for chairing that session so well. We ranged far and wide, and there were some worthwhile overlaps, I think, between these three key issues, where acting on one of them helps the others, etc. So basically now we're going to take a break for lunch, which I hope you've all organised something to hand for that. But before I do, I'm just going to ask my colleague Justin Andrew to explain how the social interaction can continue within our Hop-In platform. It is possible to have one-to-one conversations, meetups within this platform. Justin, how does that work?
Indeed. Hi, everyone. During the lunch break, there are numerous ways basically to network with your fellow attendees. On the right-hand side here, you've got the text chat, which sends messages to everyone currently in attendance. However, there's also an option to send private messages and have one-to-one video conversations with individual attendees. If you click on the second tab along here where it says attendees, and then you find the person you want to have a conversation with, you click on their name and you can invite them to a video call, send a message to them, or schedule to speak to them, after the conference is finished. Equally, for general chatting, if you want to chat in a group, we have another option. This is, if you look to the left of the screen, just below the stage, there is this networking tab just here. You just click on that, and there's a networking room here, and you just click on that, and in you go. And you've got this share audio and video option here. There's my colleague in there. You just share your audio and video here, and then you'll be able to start a conversation with the people in that room.
Excellent. So personalised opportunities now, and we'll all be back at 1:45 for the afternoon, which is, if it's as good as the morning, will be very rich and informative. So thank you very much, everyone who's contributed so far, both on screen and in the chat. I look forward to seeing you all again at 1:45.